Hey guys, how you going? I'm VaulSC. Today I'm going to talk about N4, which is the fourth edition of infiNity the game. After many years, we're now into speculation about the next edition. So this was announced at Gen Con very recently, and the idea is that N4 will probably come out in a year from now, the following Gen Con, so I'm told. In this video, I'd like to discuss just my wrap-up and my summary of everybody else's opinions. There was a thread recently on the infiNity forums where a lot of people sort of weighed in because, CB is asking for feedback, so naturally you get a lot of people wish listing and sort of voicing their opinions, some loudly, some quietly. I've read through the thread so that you don't have to. There's about 20 pages of this. I would say that the first 5 to 10 pages have most of the actual constructive comments, and the remainder of it's mostly arguing and natural forum stuff, picking on other people. So I've picked out the issues that I think are the interesting ones and the important ones, and I'll comment on them. And I also want to sort of add my own suggestions and my feelings about which way things would go. I know it's a while off, and this is mainly just triggered by the fact that right now it's a topic and it's just been announced, and realistically there'll be more to say about it when the edition actually comes out, or in the lead up to it, or if there's any sort of beta testing of any kind. Speaking of which, if I was Corvus Belli, I would probably, put out some of their proposed changes closer to the time, like, 3 to 6 months from the actual release of the next edition, just saying where they're going to be going with it and getting people to playtest a few things, as a beta, as a worldwide thing. I've made myself a little document here, and, you guys can look through this while I'm talking, but these are the main points that I'm sort of just going to be discussing in this video today, going through and explaining what it's all about, identifying the issue, and really talking about how I think infiNity could be better or worse depending on what they do. So the overarching thing, and I think the one issue that I want people to take away from this video, like if you only really tune in for this one thought and not anything else, it would be that the experienced players in the community seem to be saying that they would prefer a little bit of a tidy up of rules and a bit of a consolidation and some minor tweaks rather than a major overhaul, and that's exactly how I feel about it as well. I think only the armchair gamers and the peripheral sort of players and people who are less experienced, they're the only ones really saying, okay, we need a massive sort of rework of this one particular issue. infiNity the game as a core rule system is pretty good. You still want to keep the same order system, the same kind of movement, the same arrows, the same silhouette system. The really fundamental stuff needs to stay there. I find the weakest parts of infiNity are the peripheral stuff. The missions, I feel, are the weakest. The faction balance and some of the abilities being more useful and stronger than others. That's stuff that you can sort of tidy up. But the core part of the game needs very little improvement or change. So I think a lot of people hoping that the new edition will really just be more of the same and keeping the game fairly intact, rather than any radical changes or any really weird risks and experiments by Corvus Belli. I mean, that's something they can do internally, but if they're going to get their entire worldwide player base to pick up a different game, the last thing you want to do is bring in a new edition that turns a lot of people off, like Games Workshop has done sometimes, and Privateer Press has done sometimes, in my opinion. So yeah, we're really looking at just trying to identify the few problems with the game and just tweak them. Even if you don't remove the problems entirely, just make them less impactful, and you take the stuff that's good about the game and preserve it. Let's go through some of these issues. So intent play, I've already done 2 YouTube videos on this topic, no less. It's a bit of a forum bingo style issue. We're talking about just roughly the idea that when you're checking for line of sight, a lot of people, in fact the majority of the community, prefer to play it in such a way that you have a conversation with your opponent, you ask whether line of sight is going to be possible when you make a movement, and you determine what the line of sight is before you actually take certain actions. Whereas there are a few, minor part of the community, less of a majority, but a minority, where you declare the order with your trooper first, and then we just see what happens after that, and you get gotcha'd. And I mean, there are so many arguments for left or right on this, and I really would direct you to the videos that I've already posted about it. I can post them in the comments if you like, but you know where to find them. What I do want to say in this video is that they've got an opportunity to comment on this and actually incorporate it somewhat into the rules. And if I was Corvus Belli, I'd be really careful about doing that. You've got two pretty, how should I put it, stubborn sides here, and if you're going to give winners and losers here, that's really going to turn off a lot of people. If anything, I would really just, in the section of the rulebook for N4, just clarify, how to gain line of sight a little bit more in terms of, when can you measure for line of sight, and make that section really clear. If you're allowed to sort of ask your opponent for a line of sight call on any part of the battlefield at any time, that might be okay. At the moment, it's a little bit vague about whether you can do that. And what we're talking about is whether, theoretically, you can place a Silhouette 2 model down in some part of the battlefield before actually moving there, and asking your opponent whether it's possible to put it there and only bring it in line of sight of this model but not that model. Most players of infiNity want that to be a thing, right? You also want to be able to have a conversation with your opponent where, if I move out with this unit, and am I going to be seen, or what models are going to make it, am I going to be seen by? And it's really, I think it would be important to strengthen that in the actual core rule set. Because infiNity is a game where, it may not be great to actually have to constantly get up out of your chair and walk around the other side of the table and examine everything. It'll make the game take a lot longer. As I've said in previous videos, a lot of people use those two-dimensional flat camo markers, which might just be sitting behind the lip of a paper Mototronica style infiNity Corvus Belli building, and you won't actually physically be able to see it across the table unless you stand up and walk around there. It's much easier to just ask your opponent to tell you if you're going to get shot at when you move out, and have a conversation about it. There are people who criticize the whole intent sort of side of things just because some people really abuse it, but it's better to have it than not. And if Corvus Belli has some particular way of limiting it so that you can't go, okay, I'm going to infinitely slice the pie so I can see just that model but not the other one that's standing right next to it, maybe there's a way. But I don't think I want to go into that topic in this video so much. If you guys want more content from me about intent versus the player's lies kind of camps, and that big divide and that big debate, I can definitely put out more content on it. But in N4, I'd really only be looking for a small tidy up of that and a bit of progress on it without, a complete and total Corvus Belli taking one side on it and really incorporating that in the rules too much. Because it's more about the outside etiquette of, people and communities, more so than the actual technical black and white of the rules and how to play. Next topic we'll talk about is critical hits, and I want to bring this up because so many people are talking about it on the forums with N4 being a possibility. We've always known that we can't just ask Corvus Belli to just suddenly make a change to it, willy-nilly, because it's just such a big part of the rules. But with the new edition coming out, people are recognizing that there's an opportunity to do something about it. And we've got to be careful about this one, I reckon, because crits are such a integral and fundamental part of the game, and as soon as you start messing with it, it starts to mess with the balance quite a lot. You've got a game where any one guy with a gun can kill any other model, whether it's your cheap-ass line trooper versus your massive armor 10 tag. That line trooper just has a bit of a chance thanks to critical hits. And on the other side of it, crits can be really oppressive and turning off new players and ruining games where you outplayed somebody because you had this model that had a 95% chance to really just finish the game off, and that one single dice roll removed him. And a lot of people feel salty about that. After playing infiNity pretty solidly for 4 or 5 years, I'm really feeling that critical hits shouldn't be on your high priority list of things to fix. I wouldn't mind if they tweaked them a little bit, but you got to be careful about them. The thing about critical hits is that once you start to understand infiNity better and you get really good writing lists, you can manage risk a lot better. Imagine a situation where you move out with your 1 wound trooper and your HMG and you've got great modifiers and stats. Let's say it's like a NIS HMG and you're firing at that TR bot and the other guy rolls a crit and you lose your model and you're feeling really salty later on because, had it not been for that one dice roll, the game would have been a bit more interesting. But my response to that is that, if you're so worried about that, and if that's really going to tilt you that hard, there are other options within your faction, and there are certain factions that just have a lot of options in general for dealing with that very situation. If you get crit by something in ARO, you can bring a doctor or an engineer to revive your model and keep attempting that, which is a big difference, right? There's a lot of stuff in the game that's shock immune now or has 2 wounds, and there's the ability to sort of just fail the face-to-face roll and duck behind a wall. There's also a pretty big difference between deploying your model in a position where if it goes unconscious, it can still be shot, versus deploying a model in a situation where it goes unconscious and it will drop prone behind a wall as a result. There are a lot of things you can do to mitigate that risk. Also, although crits are inevitable, you can always design army lists in such a way that there are several models in your list which can actually carry out jobs and actually get roles completed and win games, rather than just relying on one thing that, if it dies to a crit, you're going to lose. And I think this is something that newer players tend to miss, and that less experienced players tend to complain about a bit more when it comes to crits. Also, in the long run, you're going to win some games because of crits, lose some games because of crits. Also, you're going to win some games in spite of crits, and you're going to lose some games in spite of crits. And it does balance out. There is a lot of variance in infiNity, but when it comes to variance, I'd be more in favor of removing some of the other kinds of variance rather than playing around with this. For example, the lieutenant role being too important in missions, if that's mitigated, then we take some of the variance out of the game, for example. Or what we'll talk about later in this video, scoring objective points from willpower checks that go after classifieds and consoles. If you make that a bit tidier and that less luck-based, that brings the overall variance of the game down. And once we start doing that, we see that crits become one of the few last remaining things that create a lot of variance in the game, and that's good because you still want to have that swing. You want to have luck as part of your game, because that is what brings us into new situations that we weren't expecting, and that's what's fun. That allows us to use our problem solving and enjoy being in a game situation that we haven't been in before, that we weren't expecting, and that can be a really good thing. Fatality level 2 obviously needs to go. That's a real blight on the game at the moment. Not because Rama or Shazvasti are too powerful overall, but because the ability is so oppressive and it takes away a lot of player interaction, and it kind of wrecks the natural balance of guns and troopers and model interactions in various ways that I don't want to go too far into. But obviously, if Fatality 2 is still around after the next edition, people will be angry, including me. I've looked at a few of the suggestions coming up. One suggestion I saw in the thread was that a critical hit does a damage 20 hit rather than automatic wound, meaning that if you're sitting there with your avatar or your Yotum or what have you, you may actually pass some armor saves that were going to be crits otherwise, so your bigger things aren't going to get crit so easily. Those folks, I feel like, are responding to situations where Fatality is still there. If you take Fatality out, I don't know whether the damage 20 crit would be worth it, because then you've got a lot of these really big models that just can't be shifted. You'll have, the Avatar and the Yotum and Cutter are so difficult to remove already without the right tools. You can make them impossible to beat at range if you're changing crits in that particular way. The other variant I saw a fair bit is where the face-to-face roll. So one thing you can do about it is you say, if the crit is not a roll that would win the face-to-face roll, it doesn't automatically cause a wound, but it does win the face-to-face roll. For example, you firing your combi rifle, you roll a 1, 3, and a 9, and the 9 is, wins the face-to-face roll, but your opponent rolls an 8, and the 8 was a crit for them. So let's say the 8 still does an automatic wound, but it doesn't beat the 9. So the person who rolled the crit still has to take an armor save, for example. So it's a bit more violent. It does still allow you to get some damage done, even if your opponent gets really lucky. I'm not sure. It could be a more difficult thing to track and a more difficult thing for newer players to remember, and I'm not even sure if it's entirely necessary for the game going forward. Again, there are always people who are going to sort of feel a bit salty and a bit unhappy about crits, but once the game finishes and you sort of calm down a bit, that you find things that you could have done differently during that game, and I don't feel like it's all about crits or the need to change them. If Corvus Belli does make some very small tweak to them, it's not going to ruin the game. I'm still going to play infiNity. I'm still going to be okay with it, but I don't know if it's really that needed. There are definitely other things you can change around the round crits, around the game, to make crits fit in a bit better. Multispectral Visor, in particular MSV2 and 3, I think we should talk about, and also terrain mods. By terrain mods, I'm talking about terrain features that have penalties to hit, for example, forests. I heard someone say that the reason why MSV2 and 3 and 1 and even cost quite a lot of points is that I think Corvus Belli have intended that there are a lot of terrain modifiers out there naturally in your games, and it's not just a warehouse full of containers, but there are things out there that subtract penalties from everybody that has, everybody except those who have MSV2 skills. And that may be true. We definitely do see that MSV2 costs quite a bit. MSV2 is worth it if you're making a lot of use of it with a very powerful ARO piece like a sniper, or you're stacking it with smoke. MSV3 is where things really get a bit out of control. I did see a couple of people noting that it would be good if we went back to previous editions of infiNity where MSV3 could shoot at marker state automatically, and I think that's quite intriguing. So imagine there's a intruder sniper up there in marker state, and you've got your Aquila Guard which moves around the corner, and instead of having to discover and potentially fail, instead of having to discover automatically but not get to shoot, you can just skip that step and shoot automatically. Would that be broken? Would that be too overpowered? I'm going to say no, because in the game at the moment we've got the Aquila Guard, the Asura, we've got the Torontid. Those are the guys with MSV3, unless I've forgotten about somebody. And those models at the moment currently are not broken, they're not overpowered, and a lot of folks would say that they're a little bit underpowered even because of that skill, and they cost a bit too much. That change would still only be effective against camo markers. It wouldn't really change their applicability against smoke and ODD and things like that. And at the moment, marker state really is just too forgiving, I feel. You've got the ability to sort of move out in front of something that can discover you, and then keep moving, and you just can't get it shot at all, as long as that second short skill brings you into total cover. Whereas if your opponent's really broken the bank and actually splashed out on that MSV3 model, you can no longer do that, and you have to play around that and actually come up with some other way of winning against that. And I'd be all for that. I really don't think that you're going to break the game by returning to that, especially just for the sake of those 3 models, and given how much they cost and the investment you have to make and the list you have to build around those models to work. Yeah, let me know what you guys think. I don't know whether I'd change the game to say that you are going to enforce more terrain mods that require MSV2 to get around. Maybe some missions where MSV helps. That could be a good way to go. People are talking about the fact that willpower checks on objectives is quite luck driven sometimes, where you fail several willpower checks and that can cost you the game really, and it's not very satisfying for either player. It's just really a roll of the dice, and it's kind of silly to try and imagine a specialist trooper fumbling around with an objective trying to complete the task, whereas some other specialist just did it straight away, and that's not really based on which faction you're playing or the willpower of your trooper. And a lot of times, I know that willpower is a factor, but it's not a matter of you take one specialist in your list which is automatically going to complete them and another one which is going to struggle. Everybody's in the same camp. Somebody mentioned that you should be able to spend a long skill to complete it automatically. I'd be fine with that, or even just getting a bonus like +3 or even +6 to completing the objective if you do the long skill standing there. Bearing in mind that a long skill means that somebody can just pop out of hidden deployment and shoot you, so it's a risk, and you have to have already made it into base contact with that objective. You can't move to it 4 inches and then press it, or you can't move away from it and press it, which currently a lot of people do. you'd have to stick there. So it's a temporary thing where you're sort of stuck there for a little while, and I'd be fine with that. It might just be a matter of fixing up missions, though, and this is what it ties into with the amount of time you spent pressing buttons and the willpower that you've got, or the mods that might be present in the missions being a factor. I don't mind missions which have, +3 if you're a hacker or a chain of command or whatever it might be. I just don't feel it's ideal because some factions have very few models that they really want to commit to actually to do that, and others do. For example, if you've got access to a soft detect, well, you're always going to take it anyway. Whereas if you play Ariadna and you want to have a hacker there just for the sake of pressing buttons on objectives, that's kind of annoying. So I don't really love that. But again, if you're able to pick up an objective just by staying there, or if you get a bonus if you failed several times, like so you fail the first one, you get +3 the second time around. A lot of people have tabled that as well, and I'd be fine with that. All of these ideas are better than the existing system, right? They're improvements. So, zone of control shenanigans, people have said that the game really feels a bit naff, a bit sort of shoddy with what you can do here. We're talking about situations where you move your model, and it comes within zone of control of an enemy model, but that enemy model can't see you yet because you haven't come around into line of sight. That enemy model is allowed to do a zone of control change or a reset, and because it's allowed to, it must, otherwise it loses its ARO after your second short skill, unless it has Sixth Sense level 1 or 2. So what you do is you move in zone of control. If you have the ability to use stealth, you optionally turn that off, so you declare that you're not using stealth because it's optional, to force them to waste their arrow, and then you come around the corner to close combat. Or if you have MSV2 and you're in a cloud, you shoot them because they couldn't see you after the first short skill. Some people are talking about making delay a bit more widespread, but the problem with that is that you make defending too strong in that case, and you do away with the benefit of Sixth Sense, which is a pretty good skill. I have some ideas. I quite like the idea of certain hacking programs granting certain models Sixth Sense level 1 so that you can actually play around it. You can anticipate your opponent pulling this kind of trick on you, so you can set that position up with your guy with a flamethrower so that you can delay as they're coming around to close combat and burn them. That's one way to do it. I did also think of an idea where you could add in a completely new type of ARO into the game that any model can do. And that is a zone of control ARO, where if your opponent is not using stealth and they move in zone of control of you, you can either reset, like you already can, or you can change face, like you already can, change face dodge, or you can do something called a predict. And if you declare a predict, it means that you are delaying your ARO exactly like you would be with Sixth Sense level 1, but you've got to pass a willpower check to be able to do that, and it's at -6. So it's a risk. But the thing is, if you're moving Shinobu in such a way that you're trying to get around their flamethrower on their really low-cost trooper, like the Echidron, and you're trying to get into close combat so you can destroy it easily, and if they go for a predict and it's going to pass on a 7 or less, and if they do pass, they're going to be able to delay and flamethrower you, well, you might not want to go around there. And that's possibly why this wouldn't be a good addition to the game, just because it would make it a little bit harder for those close combat specialists to get in there. But I'd still like to see it, actually, because models like Shinobu and the rest can make use of stealth and smoke grenades and various other tricks and shooting to get in there. And by doing this, it would really make it a bit more of a thinking man's game in those situations rather than a bit of a no-brainer. And it would remove these really ugly situations where you move in with a link team where one guy's a hacker with stealth or whatever it is, or there's a smoke grenade and the Rushi or Kodali or somebody moves in and just kills everything because they can't attack back. And predict kind of stops that a lot. It might even need to be a bigger modifier than -6, like even -9 or something like that, where you're imagining your trooper and you're really feeling like you're about to get attacked, and in desperation you just flip around and fire your gun at that moment, not knowing whether there's an enemy coming around the corner at that time, and you might whiff completely, but there's a very small chance that you'll actually just hit them full in the face and it was worth it. But they definitely do need to come back to the way that stealth works, the way that delays work, that the zone of control works, and that kind of thing. Currently, I do believe it's legal to move near to an enemy model in close combat, force them to reset, and then use your second shot skill to move into the close combat. Whereas if that were not possible, moving into close combat with them would mean that you have to fight them straight away. And if they're a really, super powered close combatant, they just kill you. Let's say you've got your ninja in close combat with an enemy ninja, and you've just got your cheerleader moving up. You want to move into close combat, but the ninja's just going to swipe you. But if you can move into close combat without giving them an ARO, you then spend a new order on your ninja, which attacks them with the help of the guy who's now moved into close combat. And I just feel like that's a bit cheap. The next thing that people have been talking about here is building line of fire and doors. In our games, we usually play with what's called muddy windows, where you can see into a building, but not from one side into the window and out the other side. And there are a few really rational reasons why that's the case. If you don't play it that way and just play true line of sight, there are a lot of really thin lines of fire that you're constantly missing. There's nothing worse than starting to shoot at somebody and then realizing that they had AROs a couple of orders ago, which they didn't even see. It also saves you a bit of time sort of getting down next to the tabletop and sort of eyeballing things and trying to figure out whether you're going to be able to move past or not. Whereas if you can just see into the building but not out of it, the other side, it's a lot more straightforward. And you can even play it so that, if you're in the dead center of the building, you can't be seen unless you move up to the window. There's a couple of different ways of doing it, but if there was a universal, in the rulebook way of playing it, I feel like you wouldn't even need to waste the time with that conversation at the start of the game. Everybody just has the same experience. Doors as well. I remember one point in time where a lot of people thought that doors should be a bit more elaborate. You should be able to use the activate skill. And when we playtested things, everybody seemed to agree that you don't want doors slowing down the game. You don't want a situation where you've got a beautiful building with all these doors and your models just avoid it because they're going to get trapped by the movement penalties so much. It's just much better to go around it. The best way to play doors, in my opinion, is that they open automatically when you move near them. Right? You don't have to spend any skills or slow down in any way. Impetuous troopers treat them like they're not there. They just move straight through them. I quite like the idea of doors opening when you're within an inch of them and closing automatically when you're not. That's something that can easily be implemented and easy to remember. You can look at the table and see that there's a model within an inch of a doorway, and that is enough to know that it's open. You can move your guy to the side of the door and have cover there, and the door's always open. Or you can pull back from it and the door's closed so that other models in the building are safe from long-range guns. And I just think that's just nice and clean. You don't want the game to be slowed down by how you're thinking about that mechanic. You want to be focusing on the other stuff. And infiNity's detailed enough as it is without really needing that sort of thing. Defensive hacking devices it's a real shame because this is a big chunk of the rules and it's just currently not used, and people don't take defensive hacking devices. They're really weak. They're really not worth it. But what I'm seeing from some players is that they could be incorporated. We could streamline it by removing defensive hacking devices and having them as certain upgrades on certain models, or making defensive hacking devices do something different. I've seen some people say that you should be able to use it as an ARO if another hacker's targeted something in your zone of control, which I like. So let's say you've got a tag and your defensive hacking device is nearby and they try and attack the tag with their hacker. You can respond to that hacker with your defensive hacking device with a counter-strike or whatever it might be, as if you were the model being attacked. I really like that. I also like the idea that there could be some very useful supportware programs. We were talking earlier about the zone of control delay thing. What if you could use your defensive hacker to spend a long skill to add a supportware to a tag, heavy infantry, or remote, and give it 6th Sense level 1? I think that'd be really cool because if you've got your tag out there in midfield and you're really worried about it, somebody getting the jump on it, adding 6th Sense level 1 might be really useful, and your defensive hacking device is doing something really useful there as well. And that might, give you a reason to take it. I've written the words offline mode here, and that's because I had a pretty interesting idea recently for hacking. I think that assault hacking devices and normal hacking devices and everything we've got in the game for hacking probably should stay in the game because the framework's there for it to be interesting. But offline mode is an idea where in the same way that your trooper can go prone, at the start of a short skill, you're allowed to declare whether your hacking device is going online or offline. And you put a marker next to it in the same way that you'd put a prone marker next to it if it's prone. So you put that offline marker next to it, and you can deploy offline if you want to. And offline simply means that you're treating that model as if it didn't have a hacking device and can't be hacked. And of course, you can't do any hacking while you're offline as well, for obvious reasons. So the implication of this is that if you've got an assault hacking device out in the midfield, you can make it offline, which means that a trooper like the Locust, for example, you might find that a bit more useful, putting it out there and making it safe from killer hackers until you need to do something with it. The enemy can still lock you down with pitches and have a killer hacker nearby, but it becomes about position then. You can move around, you can shoot things, and you're not dead the moment you activate. I like the idea that you can switch it on and your opponent can ARO as soon as you switch it on, for example. It's also making Transmission Matrix a much better mission, because then you can start to take hackers, make them offline, or bring them online when you start to get later in the game and start killing their enemy hackers, things like that. And it just means that hackers that do not have Marcus State gain so much from that. You can have DeFerson, for example, in his Link team, and he's suddenly not a huge liability. Note that offline mode would not be available to tags and remotes and things that are normally hackable. The example of DeFerson there, you've got a heavy infantry model who's also a hacker. If he goes offline, he's still got his armor. He can still be attacked by Oblivion or whatever it may be, but he can't be hit by a Red Rum, for example. So I quite like that idea, and I think that would encourage people to be a bit more crafty with their hackers. I think it would be a bit of a setback for the hacking factions of the game that are already really good at it. But note that you could take a lieutenant hacker and it wouldn't be automatically just killed, for example. So I really like that idea. I don't know whether they would want to make it such that you can go online, offline with a marker without revealing it. I think you probably should be able to. Also, offline, online is a way of your opponent being able to tell whether your marker is actually a hacker or not. You could do something about that. But I do like the idea of the hacking game progressing in that way, that it's just not so obvious that this kind of hack is terrible and this kind of hack is fantastic. You start to level the playing field in a really interesting way. Weapon fixes, I started with N3, and a lot of people told me that HMGs used to be like the killer gun, where there wasn't really a bad range band, and the good range band went for ages, and it was just the king of weapons, and they fixed that. Guns should have strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, they need to do something about the SMG, and I'm sure they will. SMG could be fixed in a number of different ways. You could nerf the range band a little bit. You could nerf the ammunition a little bit. You could change the points cost so it's not just a dramatic reduction. So many different things you could do. But most of the game's weapons are actually okay. Like all your chain rifles, combi rifles, shotguns. I think they're really fine. One comment I wanted to make was about weapon types, so ammunition types, and armor piercing in particular. I've always thought that armor piercing should round down rather than up. If you think about it, your armor piercing gun should at least be a little bit effective against a Fusilier with one armor, because you're gonna, cut through his chest armor a little bit more easily, right? Does that make sense? But in the current game, it's just rounded up, so it gives you no bonus whatsoever against a guy who's got that really thin bit of armor. If anything, armor piercing should be more effective against stuff with a thin amount of armor, rather than, tag with, a huge big chunk of armor, right? So against a Jotun, you're subtracting 5 from its armor, but with a Fusilier, you're subtracting 0. What I'd like to see again is that rounding down. So if you are shooting it against a Fusilier and you're not worried about him being removed from the table, you'd use armor piercing instead of shock. It just makes a lot more sense. And against stuff like the Avatar, things with, say, 5 armor, armor piercing suddenly becomes more useful. Like bringing a guy with armor 5 down to armor 3 isn't that great, whereas if it's from armor 5 down to armor 2, suddenly, that seems a little bit more juicy. And armor piercing is an ammo type in this game that really is not, cost effective, priced appropriately, or desirable for players, I think. I read some people talking about AD drop reliability and scatter control, and it does strike me as a little bit strange that things that scatter always go exactly 16 inches. That's never really sat right with me. it becomes a little bit too monotonous, too predictable, I feel, and I would like to see something about troops scattering in such a way that it's more likely they'll scatter closer to the point, and that the scatter distance is randomized. I think with there was one edition of 40k where you roll 2d6 and you subtract the model's ballistic skill kind of thing, and that's where you end up landing. There might be a way of throwing a dice and subtracting something like the physical stat or some factor that the model has, like the level of AD it has, and some troopers being better at landing in the right zone and other troopers scattering further off the board. I think there's a bit of room for that. I don't know whether they'll continue the ITS idea of airborne deployment not needing the template to land in, but I guess we'll find out more from the ITS season that's coming up, more so than N4. But at the moment, airborne deployment, I think, is in a decent place. Mark state predictability, holo decoys. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is the fact that at the moment the game is starting to get quite solved quite easily, and people are getting to a point where they understand their opponent's list so well and the faction so well that you can look at a camo marker and figure out what it is based on where on the table it is. I really like the closed information side of infiNity, and I'd like there to be a bit more, closed information play available to people. Imagine if you were able to spend a couple points in your army list and add in, markers that you could throw in just as pure decoys that didn't do anything other than, pretended to be an intruder or something like that, or made it a bit more likely. I do think that mines, for example, you should be allowed to put a prone marker next to it if you want to, so that your opponent can't automatically tell it's a mine just because it's standing up. That gets a little bit predictable. Holo echoes and holo projector level 1. I think what you should be able to do is have an advanced version of Holo 1 where you don't have to stay as the same silhouette, and you don't have to tell your opponent about the training or about whether it's hackable, for example. So Holo should be nice and advanced where you can declare that your model's hackable, even if it isn't, until your opponent tries hacking you. I mean, that should be the cleverness of Holo. You should be able to say that you're actually an impetuous trooper, even though you're not, and temporarily gain the impetuous rule or the irregular rule while you're pretending. Imagine that. So you're not the Rushi, what's the other one? The, gosh, I've forgotten what it's called. The Yuching remote that has Holo projector level 2. Let's imagine you are pretending to be something like, in JSA, you're pretending to be like an Aragoto. Well, let's pretend that Holo allows you to actually drive around like an Aragoto until you get revealed. Stuff like that would mean that kind of rule is a lot more desirable. A lot more useful, shall we say. So the game definitely has a lot of room for that kind of stuff, but at the moment it's just very predictable. You put your intruder model up there or whatever it is, and your opponent knows what it is, and they play around that. There definitely could be a lot more of that in there. And the way that that courtesy lists as well make things a bit too transparent. I feel like courtesy lists give a bit too much information away, and I think there was an errata as well that meant you had to tell your opponent which groups your camo model markers are in. It's just too easy to determine things, I feel. Holo projector, by the way, could use a buff in Holo 2 as well, where it's just like, you move, your opponent gets a delay where they otherwise wouldn't, and the best you can do is surprise shot. It just gets a bit much. Holo's really good with drop troopers, I feel, but other than that, it's a bit overcosted. Jammers, symbiomates, posthumans are written down here. Well, I mean, that's something I've been talking about to death for so long. Everybody feels that there are these things in the game which are too powerful. Symbiomates have been reduced in power, and they're in a better spot at the moment, but they're still a bit too strong. Jammers definitely are too strong. Some people have been saying that they should be targetable by hackers. I love that idea. I think that, giving them a weakness is a great thing. If you're able to fire a pitcher next to them and hit them with your killer hacker and destroy them that way, or some hacking program that, some hackers have, that means you can do something about them, whereas at the moment, you can't really do anything about them unless you just got veterans moving around. Yes, you can use stealth to try and get around there, but it's just too much effort and resources proportional to how easy it is for your opponent just to set them up. Posthumans are overcosted, obviously. They're the one thing that makes OSS and LF, a bit strong. But that's easily fixable just in the points costs, I feel. Not too much needs to be done there. And I don't want to use this video to talk too much about balance of individual units and profiles. I already do that a ton in my analysis videos for factions. Total immunity, I think everybody agrees that it's too strong. What I would say is that, you want to introduce a few vulnerabilities to total immunity. You could easily do this by just going through the specific models in the game that do have that ability and just add in some more stuff. Like McMurray and that, they're immune to viral, but you need to be adding in some kinds of immunities for the Karakuri or whoever actually has them, because running around there and just being able to tank everything and shrug everything off is just too much. And the immunity to flash pulses as well, I think, is just a bit too egregious. I don't know what you'd want to do about that, but being able to just completely shrug it off seems strange. Also, the idea that if you're trying to hit McMurray with an EM grenade, instead of the immobilization factor of it with EM, he just treats it like normal ammunition, so he's taking a wound instead. I don't feel it like that's quite right. It's strange that you would change the effect that it has rather than ignoring it completely. Like, it doesn't seem very consistent. People have been talking about pre-measuring. I know everybody feels differently about this. I've been playing wargames for years and years and years, and I'm very good at measurement guessing, and infiNity is one of the last few games, the last bastion holding out against all other games changing over to pre-measuring. And I like it. I don't really want pre-measuring in the game. Obviously, it's not going to change much if it is added. Some people are arguing that it will make the game take longer. I don't think it will take much longer, but I don't think it brings anything good into the game either. You're catering a little bit better to newer players and so forth, but I don't think that's something you necessarily want to do in this way. I feel that even new gamers are kind of a lot of them are going to be captivated by the idea that they have to guess, and there's a bit of uncertainty, just like there would be in a real firefight where you're not 100% sure if you're going to be in range or if that chain rifle is going to blow you up or the mine's going to kill you, for example. And just think about that, like with mines and so on and crazy koalas. Imagine being able to move 8.5 inches away and just getting away all the time and never, accidentally stepping into these things. It would just totally reduce the value of those abilities in a way that would not be great. And staying out of range of hackers and stuff like that, just not great. I don't think it should be added. Last one I've got there isn't actually brought up in the thread, but I thought I'd throw it in as well. I've talked about it in other videos, but retreat is not a positive part of this game. It really isn't. My point there is that if you're a good player and you're planning on just crushing your opponent, retreat's not going to stop you from doing that. You can easily just figure out, how many models you need to kill or not kill to completely cripple them, and retreat isn't going to deter you from doing that. On the other hand, it can be abused. So again, if you're a good player and your opponent happens to be getting quite lucky and winning a war of attrition, it just gives you an out that you couldn't otherwise have, where if your opponent forgets, and you don't want to win a game because your opponent forgot, but if they forgot that they're going to give you an advantage there, you move a couple of models with a command token, putting them back into active state outside of Lost Lieutenant, whatever it is, and you score a couple of objective points and you win. It's just a horrible feeling. And really, seriously, there's a bunch of people out there who really feel like, it's going to deter people from just crushing people rather than going after the mission. Just not the case. It's just not true. I've played so many games now, and I can honestly tell you that I've never once, held back from, destroying my opponent in terms of attrition because of that rule. The only thing it makes you think differently about is, where to draw the line and how badly to choke them off before winning the game. It's just a matter of having one more thing to remember. So N2, obviously a long way away. N4, I should say. And probably the game's going to change a fair bit before then, even. More stuff coming out. But Corvus Belli have got a good track record of generally fixing more things than they break. What will usually happen is that they'll introduce a whole new thing, and they'll mess a few things up along the way, but most of the changes will be positive. So cautiously optimistic that we'll get an even better game than we have now. And let's just hope that they don't, obviously, they're not going to do this, but let's hope that they don't actually go and listen to every single person, because there's a lot of people out there giving some pretty dumb suggestions. But these have been my suggestions, so I hope you guys enjoyed them, and let me know what you thought.